The Gospels, there are 4 of them in the Bible. And all of them begin in different ways. And all of them begin not in the ways that you might probably expect. We think we know what to expect when we read a gospel. It's a story about Jesus, so it's going to begin with the Christmas story. And then when you turn to the Gospels, what you discover is actually none of them really begin the way that we might expect. We're thinking donkeys and sheep and, of course, a baby in a manger. But none of them give us that straight away. In fact, some of them don't even give us that at all. My particular favorite is Luke's gospel, because Luke's gospel opens by explaining that he wants to tell us a story, and then he begins to tell us the story. Now, we assume it's going to be the story about Jesus, but Luke's story begins, once upon a time, during the rule of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest assigned service in the regiment of Abijah. His name was Zachariah. His wife was descended from the daughters of Aaron. Her name was Elizabeth. Herod, okay, we've been to enough nativity plays, we've heard of him. Abijah, that sounds like something you would get a cream for. So I'm not really sure what that is. Zachariah, another slightly less unusual name. His wife was descended from Aaron. Don't know who he is. Her name was Elizabeth. Is this a story about the queen? But no Joseph, no Mary, and no sheep. But this is the story that Luke begins with. And Luke begins with this story of this priest named Zachariah, and then he gives us 3 other pieces of information about Zachariah and his wife Elizabeth. The first thing he tells us is that they're good people. They're good people. He also tells us that they have no children. Some of you might think those things are connected, but they're not. The other thing we learn is that they are very old. And the tale continues to tell us that Zachariah is one day alone in the temple doing his temple business, which is what he's supposed to do as a priest. And unannounced, an angel of God appeared, unannounced. I always think the Bible says this a lot about angels appearing surprisingly to people. And I always think it's kind of unfair. I would really love my angels to appear announced. You know, just like a text or an email, just so that I can have, my story feed live, ready to sort of put this on my social media, because that would be, because when the angel kind of comes up and surprises you, that's kind of, you lose it a little bit. So this angel appears just to the right of the altar of incense. Zechariah was paralyzed in fear because apparently this is scary. But the angel reassured him, don't fear, Zechariah, your prayer has been heard. Elizabeth, your wife, will bear a son by you. You are to name him John. John. Like John. Like an angel from God appears in the room and announces to Zechariah that he's going to have this son. And Zechariah is old and they can't have children, so that's already surprising. And then the angel unpacks to Zechariah, this son's going to be really important in God's plan to sort of draw people back to him. And his name must be John. I have a common name, all right? And one of the problems of having a common name is that nobody ever expects much from you. Hey, this is David, and okay. Everybody knows somebody called David, generally a drunk. And so when you come along and go, hey, this is our pastor, David, he's like, oh, okay, And so all... In the Old Testament, right, which Zechariah grows up reading and is a bit of an expert in, there's a point where one of the prophets gets a visit from God, and God says, hey, you're going to have a son, and you're going to call him Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. Right, now we're talking, okay? If I'm going to meet God, and he's going to give me my kid's name, I want a good name, John. Hey, John, stop picking your nose. That's kind of what you hear when you hear a name like that, not the announcer of Jesus coming to save the world. So this story comes and we hear this and yet we get told this exciting thing that this John is going to do, to which Zechariah says, do you expect me to believe this? I am an old man and my wife is an old woman. Zechariah is on his own at this stage. She's not there. It's like a slow burner for some of you, I'm an old man, my wife is an old woman, but the angel said, I'm Gabriel, the sentinel of God, sent especially to bring you this glad news. But because you won't believe me, you'll be unable to say a word until the day of your son's birth. Every word I've spoken to you will come true on time, God's time. And then Luke sort of fades this story out. He kind of leaves this story and moves on to tell us a different story. The story that we actually are expecting to hear. A story about a girl called Mary, who it turns out actually is Elizabeth's cousin. But before this story moves on, we learn a couple of things about this. And maybe some of us are like, oh, okay, so it's the cousin, so that makes sense. We know how this story is going. I mean, if you're going to tell a story, that might not be how you would start it, right? Are you with me on that? Like, I'm going to tell the story of Jesus. Who should we start with? How about we start with Jesus' mom's sister's husband? That makes sense. We'll go with that as a good place to launch the story of Christmas. Because everyone's then sitting there while we're supposed to be listening to Jesus, we're thinking, is that twice removed or 2 times? I don't really know how that, do you buy them a gift or not at Christmas when they're that far away? This is now what's sort of going on. But Luke kind of leaves this story and he now moves on to tell us about Mary and Joseph, and we hear about all the sort of stuff that feels a little bit more familiar to us. But just before he moves on, he tells us 2 things. He tells us that Elizabeth does get pregnant, despite being very old. And also he tells us that Zachariah cannot speak for the whole time. So think about this. All of their dreams and hopes have been told that they're going to come true. They wanted a family, and now this family is going to happen for them. But the story now leaves them old, speechless, and waiting. And so when I think about that, I wonder if that's the power of a story like this for us today. Not so much that this story happened, although we want to confess that it did, but that this story actually always happens. This is a story that we are all stuck in one way or another. Because at various points in our lives, we find ourselves in places that we didn't want to be in. We find ourselves stuck. For Zachariah, life is getting on for him, and the family they dreamed of isn't happening. But there are all sorts of other things that can cause you to get stuck. You can get stuck in a particular job. You can get stuck out of a job. You can get stuck in terms of your relationships. Maybe you want a relationship and you don't have one. Maybe you have a relationship and you don't want one. Maybe you're not quite sure what to do with your relationships. But we find ourselves stuck all the time, in situations and in problems and in places where we just don't want to be. What makes it worse is so often everybody else's life seems to be sort of Instagram perfect. You're kind of looking at what it is that they've got going on, and their life just looks so awesome, and everything's there together, and everything's happening for them. They sneezed bad at work one day and got a promotion. Their kids, in fact, they paid no attention to them whatsoever, but they're all on the honor roll. It's like, how does that work? And here's me stuck in my situation where it feels like someone somewhere in the cosmos has just put pause on my life, and I'm just waiting for something to happen. But of course, fortunately, we're really, really good at waiting. In centuries from now, when historians tell the story of the 21st century, one of the things they'll say about North America is, man, those people had patience. Because, we love lineups, and we love traffic, and our special favorite is when Netflix doesn't start automatically. No, let's be honest, we would much prefer it if life was a little more like Amazon Prime, I click buy and it's at my door. I don't know how they do that. There's this guy driving in my street and somehow they've been listening to my phone for the last week. I don't know what it is, but they know what I want to buy, and when I click buy, there he is. And I'm so happy about it. I don't want to watch the documentaries you're going to email me about afterwards showing me what life is like in an Amazon factory, because we want to ignore that because, I need my stuff now. Because if I don't get that new remote control, how am I going to watch Netflix? By the way, I know this image is causing anxiety for some of you. I apologize about that. Let me just help you a little bit with an image like this. I don't know if I've told you this before or not, but prior to my life in theology, I did spend a little bit of time as a computer programmer, and I basically moved from one really geeky world to another really geeky world, so I'll let you figure that out. But I want to tell you something about progress bars. Do you know the one thing that they don't do is show progress? Basically, a progress bar is just a little program written by somebody to give you the impression that something's happening. Doesn't really make any difference whether it is or not. It wants to give you something that you can kind of tap on the screen about. It's like, oh yeah, I'm sure it's moving. And you can do that thing where you're you leave your pencil on top of your iPad to see if it's moved while you went to make a coffee. Because one of the things that our programmers know is that if nothing's happening, we get all kind of nervous. If the screen just went blank and the program was working away in the background, like, you know, those of us that are like kind of Jesus followers, like we'd just be praying, like, God, I don't know what's happening, the screen's blank, but it doesn't seem like it's doing anything. The rest of us, we'd be like throwing it against the wall, you know, because anybody ever broke a computer when they were supposed, no, let's not go there. We don't do well with waiting because we like to have the sense that something is going on even when it doesn't look like it is. And the Advent stories that we tell at this time of year, it's interesting to me that they're all pregnancy stories. The story begins, hey, Zachariah, you're going to have a baby. The next story is, hey, Mary, you're going to have a baby. And then, of course, nothing happens for 9 months. Because, you see, pregnancy's hard because it's slow. I don't have immense personal experience of pregnancy myself. My silhouette is more to do with my eating habits. I'm not actually pregnant, just to clarify. But pregnancy's slow. Like, pregnancy takes 9 months. And think about this, right? 9 months you have to wait for a baby. Now, like, I don't buy things that don't say free delivery tomorrow. Okay? If it says free delivery in 2 days' time, forget it. I'm not buying from you. You know, I want my stuff now. So to be waiting 9 months for a baby, like, oh my goodness. Like, what are we going to do with that? And of course, why it's so hard to watch pregnancy or be involved in pregnancy isn't just that it's 9 months long. It's that by and large, as an outsider, as Zachariah is in our story, like nothing seems to be happening. Like, yeah, sure, Elizabeth's pregnant, but most of the time, there's not a lot of change. Most of the time, in fact, for the first little while, unless you're the lady who is pregnant, there's nothing happening that you can see. And the problem for us as humans is if we can't see something, that probably also means we can't control it. And we hate being out of control. And so Luke starts his gospel with this story of this man called Zachariah. This man who is old, he can't speak, he's out of control, and he can't see what's going on. Tish Harrison Warren in the New York Times recently wrote this: to practice Advent is to lean into an almost cosmic ache, our deep, wordless desire for things to be made right, and the incompleteness we find in the meantime. Like the ache of incompleteness. Like Zechariah's incompleteness is kind of obvious to us. Him and his wife want to have a baby. They can't have a baby. Zechariah can't speak. It's pretty obvious to see what it is that's going on and where their life isn't quite working out for them. But for most of us, our incompleteness is more hidden. Our incompleteness is less obvious. It's not the sort of thing you immediately see about a person. But the Advent story helps us with this. You see, if we do what the malls tell us we should do, which is kind of bounce from holiday to holiday, you know, just as they're taking down the Thanksgiving decorations, Christmas music starts, and then we know that in a few weeks' time when the Christmas music stops, Easter music starts again, or Valentine's Day music, or whatever it is that they're now telling us we should be part of. And the Advent story as part of the church is designed to give us a space to pause. It's designed to give us a space just to not roll one celebration into the other, but to actually stop and be aware of our incompleteness. You see, God was aware of our incompleteness, and that's why we have the Advent story. But what awareness do we have? What things are going on in my life that I actually need to take pause and think about how they're damaging me and others? What's my anger doing? What's my grief doing to me? What's my body image issues about? Or maybe it's depression or doubt. Maybe it's my own selfishness. Or just jealousy, disappointment. Or for most of us, often just our basic insecurities. All this stuff that holds me back from being the type of person that God imagines I can be because I want to live in this brokenness and not actually spend time with it. Realizing that maybe, perhaps maybe, if I'll just pause for long enough, something might start to change and shift. One of the reasons I loved Warren's quote is just the final word she puts in the sentence there, the word meantime. See, because as much as we try and forget it, and as much as we wish it wasn't true, what we really need in our lives is a God for the meantime. Often what we think about is that we maybe need a God in the future at some point. Or other times we might think, wow, God would have been helpful in the past. But the Bible doesn't give us a God of the future or a God of the past. It gives us a God of today. It gives us a God who meets us in the meantime. Not one you need to wait for in the future, or not one that did things and we don't know where he is anymore, but a God who is with us now. Why is that important to the biblical story? Why is that important to Christmas? Because remember, Christmas is the story of a God in the middle with us. The reason this is important is because the Bible realizes that that's when you need help. You need your help in the meantime. You need your help in the middle. You need your help in that moment where you're here and your dreams are over there and you want to be at those dreams, but right now you're silent, everything's silent. You're just like Zachariah. You know where you'd like things to be, but they're just not presently there. And the Christmas story, the thing we're waiting for in Advent, is that this is exactly where God is working, right here with us now. And often our temptation is to say, where is God? Kind of, you look at this, Zechariah might be thinking that, like, I had these hopes and dreams, and where is God? And maybe that's the question that occasionally resonates in our mind, or rather just, it doesn't necessarily form, but we just kind of live with that perception that he's not really there. But the Christmas story changes the question for us and actually says to us, well, where isn't God? Because he's working everywhere, even if we can't see it. Zechariah had to learn to trust that God was working, even though the only proof he had was the slowly growing belly of his wife. In the book of Acts, it tells us that God is working so that we would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. Like, I don't know what's going on in your meantime. I don't know what you're in the middle of right now. I don't know what it is that you would describe as incomplete. But Advent is rooted in this ancient belief that God is never far from you. That actually God is not only not far from you, but coming towards you. And we tell this story year on year as the church because we know how easy it is to forget that God is looking for us and finding us. But let's get back to our story. Luke leaves us with a speechless Zechariah and a pregnant Elizabeth. And he takes us off on this story where he introduces us to Mary, and we hear about how Jesus is going to be born, and there's a little meeting between Elizabeth and Mary, and we start to see how this story is going to unfold. And then he comes back to this old couple, or somewhere around about sort of 30, 40 verses later. When Elizabeth was full term in her pregnancy, Luke says, she bore a son. Her neighbors and relatives, seeing that God had overwhelmed her with mercy, celebrated with her. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child. And as I said to the choir earlier, they can talk to their school teachers about what that means later. And the crowd were calling him Zachariah after his father, but his mother intervened and said, no, he is to be called John. And they were like, John? Like, no one in your family has that name. And that's remarkable in itself because everybody has a John in their family. But they said, no one in your family is named that. So they used sign language to ask Zechariah what he wanted him named. So Zechariah asks for a tablet. And everybody hid their iPad quickly. Because, you give somebody a loan of that and they don't look after it like you want to look after it and it comes back broken, No, it used to be a writing tablet. Zechariah asked for a writing tablet, so everybody did that kind of thing that you do. When someone asks you for a pen, you do like this. Even though you've not carried a pen for 10 years, but you just feel like you should look like you're invested in their question. Yeah, sure. I have. And then, or you do that thing. I know you do this thing where somebody says, do you have a pen? You say yes, even though you don't have a pen. And then you try and figure out how long you can find it, quickly you can find a pen before they need it. You ever do that? Is that just me? Just me. Okay, so Zechariah asked for a writing tablet. Which is interesting, actually, because in his era where Zechariah lives, they don't have a lot of writing implements. So Zechariah doesn't have the ability to write regularly. Paper isn't available really easily. You'd have to be very expensive to be able to get paper and also know how to write on it. So Zechariah has probably lived in a lot of silence. There's not a lot of communication going on. Minor sign language is happening. But Zechariah asks for something to write on, and he writes, his name is to be John. Educational experts call this spacing, where you have a moment to learn the lesson, and then there's a gap between when you learn the lesson and when you apply the lesson and put the lesson into practice. Zachariah has a conversation with an angel. The angel says, you're going to have a son. His name is going to be John. And then we get 9 months of Zachariah having to silently, not talking to anyone else, live with the fact that he didn't trust the angel. And at this one moment where he gets a chance to say something, he says his name is John. What changed in those 9 months? Do you know what really gets me about this story, though? Like this is just a really strange story to begin a gospel with, right? So Luke wants to tell us a story about how God is going to save the world through Jesus. Like, how are you going to start that story? Like, maybe you could copy John and begin with a creation story of God's immense power. But Luke goes, no, I get what'll work. We're going to tell a story about Jesus' mom's sister's husband who doesn't trust God. Do you remember what Zechariah said to the angel? Like, you expect me to believe this? So Luke's story starts with a guy's response to God being, yeah, I don't believe that. And Luke goes, that's where we'll start the Christmas story. So when you're sat in a Christmas service, surrounded by all of these Christians going, I don't believe this, you are bang on line with how you're supposed to be at the Christmas service. Because the story of Luke begins with somebody going, I'm not really sure I'm about this. But what we don't get then from Zechariah is God appearing and going, loser, told you were wrong. You don't get the angels, Gabriel, coming back and smiting him. You don't get even Zechariah throwing himself on the floor and wailing. He just says his name is John. Because something's happened in the 9 months where he's gone from not trusting this angel's story to trusting this angel's story. Zechariah has learned to trust God. But it's interesting, though, to notice that Zechariah, he learns to trust God after everything. So he says, I don't believe you. He says, I'm not really buying into this story. He has 9 months of nothing to say. And then he says his name is John. He sees it come true, and then he says his name is John. And despite the fact that Zechariah didn't believe this story at its beginnings, God still did it anyway. And this is a kind of crazy, crafty little thing that Luke does. Because you see, this story isn't really a story about Zechariah. In fact, it's not really even a story about Zechariah's son, John the Baptist, when he is born. Actually, what Luke's doing is he's beginning a story of grace. It's a story about Jesus, and it's a story about how God's grace has reached us. But this is the thing. Because it's a grace story, that means that how the humans behave in the story isn't going to affect how God behaves. What the humans do isn't going to stop God doing what he does. Let me put it like this. God isn't the elf on the shelf. See, parents have got this new tradition that's apparently appeared in the last 5 years where you buy this elf and apparently he's been sent from the North Pole and you sit him in your house around Christmas time. And what the elf does is he spies on your kids. And he spies on your kids to tell Santa whether they've been naughty or nice. It's kind of good fun and everybody enjoys it because, hey, it's a little bit of a laugh and what's the elf going to do today? But let's just be aware of something. What it also does is teaches conditionality. It teaches this idea that says how you behave depends on what you get. And if you're nice, you get good things, and if you're naughty, you get bad things. And we all like a tradition, but it feels important to say in Advent that story of if you're nice, you get good things, and if you're naughty, you get bad things, that story isn't the Christmas story. In fact, the Christmas story is the exact opposite of that story. And this is why Luke, I think, starts us with the story of Zechariah. Because even though Zechariah doesn't believe, even though he doesn't trust God, even though he can't imagine that this can be true, God does it anyway. Because the reason we tell this Advent story, the reason we root deep into this ancient story is that we know that everything else in the world seems to work on conditionality. You get what somebody else thinks you deserve. The Christmas story is that you don't get what you might deserve. Instead, you get God's love. Instead, you get God's grace. Instead, you get his welcome. And our narcissism kind of likes the story of the elf because we like to believe that if I do this, this will happen, and if I do that, that'll happen, because it puts me at the center of the story. But what Christmas is telling us is that actually, if we turn it around the other way, and if we actually tell this story the way it's supposed to be told, you might not be at the center of the story, but you're definitely part of God's story. Advent teaches us that God is working and that he loves us and that he's searching for us. So may you, in your meantime, find God to be there and working with you. May you find God searching for you and healing that ache of incompleteness. And may you, even if like Zechariah, you find your faith weak and small, may you still trust the God who is working despite us, yet always, always coming towards us. And may his grace and peace be with you.